All right, class. So we're going to be going over a few of the slides in this particular presentation. First group will be like on science and the Enlightenment intellectuals. The next one will be on the revolutions, and then for next week it'll be the one on Romanticism and the Industrial Revolution. So make sure to do the assigned readings that are in the module as well. All right. So one of the shifts that happen in the modern turn is this attention towards science, and science becomes a big theme for the 18th century Enlightenment. But the roots of this glorification of science goes back all the way to the beginning of the semester, with figures like Francis Bacon, who basically promoted the idea of the scientific method and using science instead of relying on ancient thinkers. And then the big turn point was the actual science being done by Copernicus, who theorized a sun-centered universe, and Galileo, who used science via telescope to prove Copernicus's theory, and then finally Newton, who basically discovered physics. And so here you're seeing this kind of evolution in scientific thought, and instead of just like relying on tradition, religion, or other foundations for knowledge, these thinkers are basically um, basing it on empirical data and theoretical data. um, Science doesn't really take a humanistic turn, and this is more humanist as in anti-god, until the 19th century comes along. And the two basically isms that do that are positivism, which is a theory by Auguste Comte. Basically, theorized that in the ancient world, people used the gods to describe causality. Then it's the metaphysical time period, and this is basically like the early modern time period where we started our course, where the idea of like the god of nature, this one like physical being created everything. Even see the Enlightenment figures would talk about that. And then it's Comte's turn, 19th century, where he says at a positive age, basically all we have is science, and now we realize all we need is science to understand how things actually happen. So this is more theoretical. It will take Darwin and his book on the origin of species, where he'll describe natural selection, basically stating that human beings and other creatures, well, in origin of species basically talks about how creatures adapt to their environment. This is the famous beaks on the finches. And then later on in his later work, Descent of Man, he'll ascribe the same kind of blind force to nature, to how human beings have evolved. So, with that, 19th century really does do a shift in human thinking. Okay, so now before we get to the revolutions and even Enlightenment thought, we have to talk about kind of the um, state theory that existed in the 17th century and even into the 18th century. This is the political absolutist. Basically, they are. This is the rise of the European nation state. You see the break from the power of the church over these rulers, and figures like Louis the 14th here, in all his royal garb, illustrate this idea of them being where the law begins and ends. They rule by the power of God, basically, and they control the mechanisms of the state. You can see this divine idea here in King James of England, where like the angels are literally crowning him with glory. So, um, absolutism, where this one ruler basically controls the state, is goes pretty strong all the way into the 18th century in some places. But where the revolutions hit, this idea of divine right of kings falls apart. So the primary place where this begins to get dismantled is in England, where there's going to be this bloody civil war. And the theorist who basically gives the anti-revolutionary theory is a guy named Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes famously talks about human beings as brutal, we're incredibly violent, and basically said like human beings have two options. One is to rule or have the rulers. Well, let me backtrack. So basically, they have two options. Human beings are selfish and we seek after our desires, or we seek after and some pleasures, or we seek after safety. And he said you have to pick one. You can't have freedom of desire and choice, and you also can't have freedom of safety because again we're incredibly violent. And so what he theorized, as you can see in this cover image of his book Leviathan, that the city, here's the city, makes a social contract with the state. Now, in this case, here's like a monarchy, and you can see here how the state is made up of people. The this city here, these shadows, you see like the villagers bleeding into the king, and he's made up of people. So basically, we make a social contract, and that's the key thing with Hobbes. He's the first to really theorize social contract theory. So you make a social contract with with the state, and the state, and so we basically give up our liberties over to the state for protection and safety. And you can see here the Leviathan, this state is doing that. Okay. Um, Now we turn to the Enlightenment. Enlightenment actually gets going in the 17th century, and the two founding members, at least in the minds of 18th century philosophers, is Descartes and Locke. Descartes is a French thinker, a mathematician. He believes that reason is where we gain knowledge, whereas Locke believes that we gain knowledge through experience. So that's what makes Descartes a rationalist and Locke an empiricist. You see empiricism here. Um, so the way Descartes comes to knowledge, he's a guy who famously said, "I think, therefore I am." This idea was that in his philosophical method, he proposed doubting everything, and then his long conclusion from this radical doubt was to realize that he was thinking, and if he's thinking, that means he's existing. Therefore, the idea of um, um, what's it called? I think, therefore I am. So he basically posited that we're a thinking autonomous subject, and that's the birth of modern individualism. Comes from this. So the idea here is that you can see this in the text that I attached to your module with Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant basically says like, look, we're limited to what we can know in the empirical realm. So Locke's right about that. Like we can science in particular can only study what it can observe and test and touch. And but however, the individual mind is important, and its reason is important to like be utilized to gain knowledge. So, what the philosophers from Descartes to Kant have done is basically said, like, hey, our what we know is limited in that kind of abstract way, especially like things about God and stuff like that. But in some ways, these guys are kind of tired of even going there. They're more interested in uplifting the individual and the individual's rights. And in fact, Kant in his essay I posted will talk about how like the motto of the Enlightenment was for the individual to dare to use his or her own reason. So the other thing with going back to Locke, Locke is important for England because England's going to be the one to first really make the big break with the revolution. So let's go to that now. So let's jump to the revolution real quick and we'll go back to Enlightenment. So with the English Revolution, again, this is pre-Enlightenment. This happens in the middle of the 17th century and it concludes at the end of the 17th century. So that means Leviathan is in the middle of these two battles. So England had a divine right king, King Charles I, and he basically never called Parliament until he was forced to, as the notes talk about there. Basically, he was having problems with the Irish and the Scottish, and the Parliament, run by Calvinists, or in other words, Puritans, didn't trust Charles's Catholic leanings. This led to an English Civil War. You can see the years there. And crazy enough, they put him on trial, the king, and they behead him. One of the main leaders of the Parliament, Puritan faction named Oliver Cromwell, will eventually take over the English government and rule via military dictatorship. Um, Long story short, after Cromwell's dead, the monarchy is brought back in, and problem is the last of the monarchs, James II from this line, was trying to reinstitute Catholicism. This led to the English people asking somebody who is related to the royal line. This would happen to be Mary of Orange, who's married to William of Orange. They are asked to come invade England and to establish parliamentary supremacy, and that's exactly what happens. James is basically flees for his life. You have this very kind of like quote unquote peaceful revolution, glorious revolution, come in, or bloodless as was nicknamed, and basically modern England is formed. You have the Toleration Act and the Bill of Rights of 1689, which grants Parliament never can be dismissed; that it's always there, and it's kind of like chief. You have a Bill of Rights, Constitution set in, so no more divine right kings. Now the king himself is limited powers by the Constitution and the Parliament. So this is where Enlightenment really starts to take place, and general toleration of Protestantism comes in as well, and this is something John Locke would theorize. But the idea of like checks and balances that are big in like American politics, on the basis of it, comes here and in John Locke's political thought. All right, just to kind of then wrap things up in this first lecture, here you can kind of see the main themes of Enlightenment being played out. The idea of like universal reason, the idea that reason's open to anybody, anti-clericalism, this kind of mistrust of organized religion. And so you'll see like rationalist philosophers try to like rethink Christianity along quote unquote reasons thinking. The uplifting of reason and science, Enlightenment thought, the idea of progress, this feeling that history is moving forward, and human beings are going to get better as long as they trusted in things like science and reason. Politics tend to be more Unitarian, or utilitarian, I should say. Utilitarian basically means like you look out for the majority's peace. That's how politics should be done. And the most famous figure to think that was John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher of the 19th century. But it's kind of the birth of what we think of as liberalism, modern liberalism in Anglo-American political philosophy. Now, these will be radicalized by the French philosophers, people like Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot. And so next lecture, we'll look at the idea of how the French Revolution radicalized the ideas. So the core ideas being liberty, fraternity, and equality. And there you can kind of see the different ideas play out, because in some ways Enlightenment thought is a little more middle class bourgeois, but as we'll see, elements of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's political philosophy and the pushing of the general will push the revolution into a very very bloody conclusion. Okay, so that's the first lecture. The second one will be popping up pretty soon.